Welcome to a conversation about the gap between a value creation plan on paper and what it actually takes to execute one inside a company. On this episode of the Private Equity Value Creation Podcast, Shiv Narayanan of How to SaaS speaks with Jonty Yamisha, Chief Executive of Axxonsoft, whose career has spanned private equity underwriting, operating partner roles, and finally the CEO seat itself. Because Jonty has sat on every side of the table, he is unusually well-placed to explain what gets lost when investors, operators, and portfolio company leaders don't speak the same language, and, more importantly, how to close that gap. What follows is organized by theme, following the arc of the conversation from his own path through the industry to the practical frameworks he uses to align an organization behind a plan. From underwriter to operator to CEO, Jonty begins with his own journey, which turns out to be the source of his perspective. He started on the investing side, underwriting deals, where value creation is largely an exercise in models and assumptions. He then moved into operating partner roles, closer to the businesses themselves, before ultimately taking the chief executive's chair. Each vantage point taught him something different, and the through line is that the people underwriting a deal and the people running the company often experience the same plan in completely different ways. That lived experience of translating between the two worlds is what shapes everything else he shares in the conversation. Bridging financial models and operational reality. The heart of the discussion is the distance between a financial model and operational reality. A value creation plan, as it exists in an investment committee memo, is a set of numbers, revenue targets, margin expansion, a return profile. But inside the company, those numbers have to become decisions, priorities, and daily behavior, and that translation is where most plans stumble. Jonty's point is that the model and the operation are not the same thing, and pretending they are is how investors and operators end up talking past one another. The work of a good operator and a good board is to carry the intent of the plan across that boundary so that the team executing it understands not just the target but the logic behind it. The positive tension framework. Jonty describes what the episode calls a positive tension framework, the art and science of pushing an organization forward without breaking it. Growth plans, especially in a private equity-backed company, require stretch, goals that are uncomfortable by design. The skill is in applying that pressure productively so that it energizes a team rather than demoralizing it. Too little tension and the organization drifts. Too much and it fractures or burns out. The framing treats this as both an art, requiring judgment about people and timing, and a science, with repeatable ways to calibrate how hard to push and when. Board alignment, from mandates to what needs to be true. One of the most useful reframes in the conversation concerns how boards set direction. Too often a board hands down a target as a mandate, hit this number, which lands as pressure without partnership. Jonty's alternative is to turn the conversation into a shared problem-solving exercise by asking, in effect, what would need to be true for this outcome to happen. That single reframe converts a top-down instruction into a joint investigation of assumptions. What has to be true about the market, the product, the team, and the resources for the plan to work? It changes the tone from blame to inquiry, and it surfaces the real constraints early when there is still time to do something about them. The CMO budget conversation, framing ROI for investors. He applies that thinking to a very concrete and often fraught topic, the marketing budget. Conversations about how much to spend on marketing and where are frequently where operators and investors clash because the two sides frame the spend differently. Jonty's approach is to anchor the discussion in resource allocation and return on investment in language an investor recognizes, treating marketing not as a cost line to be defended, but as capital to be allocated against expected returns. When the chief marketing officer and the investor share that framing, the budget stops being a negotiation and becomes an allocation decision grounded in the same logic the investor already uses everywhere else. A unified data taxonomy. Underneath all of this sits an unglamorous prerequisite that Jonty insists is essential: a unified data taxonomy across marketing, sales, and finance. In most companies, these three functions measure the world in different vocabularies. They define a lead, a customer, a cohort, or revenue in subtly different ways, and those mismatches make it impossible to have a coherent conversation about performance. Building a common language for the data, so that everyone means the same thing by the same term, is tedious and rarely celebrated. But Jonty argues it is the foundation on which any coherent value creation plan has to rest. Without it, teams argue about whose numbers are right instead of what the numbers mean. The three factories, delivery, customer success, and go-to-market. Jonty then lays out a model he uses to think about a company as three factories, delivery, customer success, and go-to-market. Each is a distinct engine with its own inputs, outputs, and rhythms. Delivery builds and ships the product. Customer success retains and expands the base, and go-to-market wins new business. Thinking of them as factories forces clarity about what each is supposed to produce and where the handoffs between them are. It also makes visible the places where one factory's output is another's input, which is exactly where things tend to break down. The customer journey as connective tissue. The reason the three-factory model works, and is telling, is that the customer journey is the connective tissue that binds the factories together. Left to their own devices, teams default to blaming each other. Sales blames the product, delivery blames sales, customer success blames both. Mapping everything to the customer's actual journey reframes those boundaries. Instead of separate departments defending their turf, they become stages in a single continuous experience the customer moves through. That shared reference point turns cross-functional finger-pointing into a common mission, because everyone can see where in the journey the real problem lives. A CEO onboarding playbook. Listening tours across 37 countries. Jonty shares how he approached taking over as chief executive, and it centers on listening before acting. His onboarding involved listening tours that spanned 37 countries and hundreds of employees. A deliberate effort to understand the organization from the inside before imposing a plan on it. The lesson is that a new leader's first job is to gather ground truth, to hear how the business actually works from the people doing the work, to find where the real friction lies, and to earn the credibility that makes later change possible. For a global company especially, that breadth of listening is what prevents a headquarters-driven plan from colliding with realities it never anticipated. Managing investor pressure through the hold period. Finally, the conversation turns to the pressure that defines private equity-backed leadership, aggressive growth targets set against a finite hold period. A CEO in this seat has to deliver ambitious results on a clock, and Jonty discusses how to navigate that without letting short-term pressure distort the long-term health of the business. It comes back to the themes running through the whole conversation, aligning the board around shared assumptions, allocating resources against real returns, unifying the organization's language and data, and keeping every function pointed at the customer. Done well, the pressure of the hold period becomes a forcing function for focus rather than a source of dysfunction. The episode closes with where listeners can learn more about Axxonsoft and get in touch.